The biggest thing that fascinates me about Whiplash is the relationship and the power dynamic between our main character Andrew and his teacher Fletcher. From the very beginning of the movie, we can see this sort of authority that Fletcher has, just from the way people talk about him as this really high status individual, and from the way that people react around him. Everyone shows a great amount of respect to him, which really gives us a very interesting first impression of him. It's not until we see Fletcher in his natural element, which is in his own class, that we completely see what kind of person he is. This very high commanding, very a person with a lot of power within his classroom that uses it very, very vividly, as he is very verbally and sometimes physically abusive to his students. With the context of Fletcher and how he operates in his classroom, I feel like now is a good time to start introducing Andrew to the equation and how he plays a big part in this as his student, and a student that Fletcher consistently and constantly tries to push to his limits at that. The one thing we see Andrew do throughout the entire movie is try to prove himself to Fletcher, and we see this in many scenes, like the scene where he is practicing Caravan to the point where his hand is bleeding really badly and he has to put it in ice water just so that he can deal with the pain, all because Fletcher wants Andrew to go at his tempo, which is an incredibly fast tempo. And we also see this again when Fletcher is holding the three drummers to try and play Caravan in time, to the point where they spend hours doing it, and Andrew eventually prevails, but that's because of how much he wants to not just prove himself to Fletcher, but also wants to spite him in a sense. We can see how closer to the climax of the movie, how this constant pushing from Fletcher, this power, over Andrew, and Andrew's complete obsessiveness over trying to prove himself to Fletcher eventually builds up to Andrew basically pushing himself over the edge, both physically and mentally, with the part where he's speeding to that concert and he gets hit by and he accidentally gets himself into a car crash, which is what physically gives him pushes him over to the limit, but also mentally after he eventually does rush his way back to the stage and completely falls apart due to the fact that he's in a lot of pain from being in the car crash, and eventually Fletcher goes up to him and says that he's finished because he's completely ruined the song, and because of that, Andrew gets so frustrated and so angry about it that he lashes out at Fletcher, eventually leading him to completely get resigned from the college he was going to. Up to this point throughout the movie, all we've really seen with these two is how obsessed Andrew is with trying to become the best drummer in the world and trying to prove Fletcher his worth, and how Fletcher continuously pushes him to be the greatest he can through his very sadistic and abusive means. And I think what's really interesting with this relationship is how it changes in its dynamic at the very last moment of this movie. And the last scene we see Andrew get off stage after being told off by Fletcher because of how he completely bombed the first song because he didn't know the song. And eventually how Andrew came back to the stage and started taking control from Fletcher. So instead of Fletcher being the one that was the authority in the band, it was now Andrew, as he was the one that initiated Caravan halfway through Fletcher speaking, and how he it cued in the bassist and eventually the entire band. And with this scene, we see how Fletcher's a kind of synchronous between Andrew and Fletcher as they start to truly start to see eye to eye with the music, as Fletcher starts to and I guess Andrew too started to lay back on it and have a lot more fun with the music. And we really see this happening once the song Caravan ends and Andrew continues going on, completely disregarding any proper politeness or how any of this would normally go, just absolutely killing it on the drums. We see this synchronous in full display when Fletcher is guiding Andrew when he's rolling on the snare drum for him to go both slower and slower and then faster and louder until eventually he lets Andrew completely take full reins over him before finally letting the band finish off the solo that Andrew was doing. What I think is so interesting about the dynamic that these two share is that at first it starts off very antagonistic and very brutal as these two people who are very, very motivated by their love about music constantly clash into each other as Andrew consistently tries to prove himself over and over, and Fletcher, pushing him over and closer to the brink of insanity until eventually that it does, and everything comes crashing down for the both of them before eventually they end up finding each other again and they do one last job where we see the control of Andrew really show as he eventually overcomes the authority and the power that Fletcher has, and instead of standing as a teacher and a student, they end up standing as equals.